Years after his mother passed away, the young man decided to exhume her grave. When the coffin lid was opened, the sight inside left him horrified, and he screamed in terror. Ernesto clutched the edge of the table, his small hands trembling as his father cleared his throat in the kitchen. "Ernesto," Adrian said, his voice low and uneven, "I know this is hard for you, but we need someone here." The boy didn't look up. He stared at the wood grain, tracing it with his finger as though doing so might erase the last 3 months. The funeral was still fresh in his mind, how the priest had droned on, how the coffin had been closed because "it's better this way, son," how the air around him felt like it had been sucked out, leaving only whispers and sobs. But worst of all, how no one seemed to feel the same sharp, tearing ache he did, not even his father. "What do you mean, we need someone?" he finally asked, his voice flat, almost cold. Adrian hesitated. "Anna," he began, she's going to help us, around the house, for you and me." Ernesto's head snapped up, his eyes blazing with anger. "Help us? She's not helping us. She's just replacing Mom, isn't she?" "Ernesto." Adrian's tone sharpened, but then he sighed, shoulders sagging. "That's not fair. I'm doing what's best for us." "For you, maybe," Ernesto spat, pushing back from the table and storming out the back door. Later that evening, the front door creaked open, and Ernesto heard unfamiliar footsteps on the old wooden floor. The sound grated on him, louder than it should have been, like an intruder stomping through a place they didn't belong. He stayed hidden in his room, refusing to come out even when his father knocked and called for him. At dinner, he finally made an appearance, though he didn't sit at the table. Instead, he hovered near the doorway, watching as this Anna tried to settle in. She was younger than he expected, maybe late 30s, with kind eyes that didn't match the betrayal he felt radiating from her. She was setting plates, moving carefully like she didn't want to disturb anything. "Ernesto," Adrian said sternly, motioning to the chair beside him. "Come eat." Ernesto didn't move. He crossed his arms, glaring at Anna like she'd stolen something. "Why is she here?" Anna looked up, startled but calm. "I know this is a lot, Ernesto," she said softly. "I'm not here to take anyone's place. I just want to help." "I don't need your help," he shot back. "We don't need you." Adrian started to reprimand him, but Anna held up a hand. "It's okay," she said, her voice firm. "He's allowed to feel how he feels." Ernesto blinked, thrown off by her calmness. Most adults barked back at him, told him he was being rude or disrespectful. Instead, she just went back to setting the table, like his words hadn't stung. Over the next few weeks, Ernesto made it his mission to make Anna as uncomfortable as possible. He dumped salt into the stew she cooked, overturned her laundry basket, and once even left a dead mouse near her sewing kit. He watched her reaction each time, waiting for her to snap, to yell, to admit she didn't belong there. But she didn't. She cleaned up the messes silently, her lips pressed tight but never trembling. When Adrian found out about the laundry incident, he grabbed Ernesto by the arm, fury in his eyes. "That's enough," he barked. "You don't treat her like this. Do you understand?" Ernesto yanked his arm free, glaring up at his father. "You don't get to tell me what to do. You don't care about me. You just care about her." Adrian raised his hand, his palm open, but Anna stepped between them. "Adrian, no," she said quietly. Her voice had no edge to it, just a calm insistence. "He's just a boy. Let him be." "He's not just a boy," Adrian argued, his voice rising. "He's acting like someone who's hurting," Anna interrupted. She turned to Ernesto, her face softening. "It's okay to be mad," she said, "but don't let it turn you into someone you're not." Ernesto froze, unsure how to react. Her words weren't what he expected. They didn't carry anger or judgment, just a steady patience that unsettled him. One night, Ernesto sat in the woodshed behind the house, curled up on a pile of logs. The cold air nipped at his cheeks, but he didn't care. He wanted to stay out there forever, away from the warmth of the house that felt tainted by Anna's presence. He heard the creak of the back door and the soft crunch of footsteps on the snow. "Ernesto?" It was Anna's voice, not his father's. He tensed, debating whether to answer. "I'm not coming inside," he said finally. "I'm not here to make you," she replied. There was a pause, and then he heard the rustle of her coat as she sat on the steps. "It's colder out here than it looks." Ernesto didn't respond, hugging his knees to his chest. They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the wind through the bare branches. "I miss her too, you know," Anna said eventually. Ernesto's head shot up, his eyes narrowing. "You didn't even know her." "No," Anna admitted. "But I know what it's like to lose someone." Her words hung in the air, fragile and sincere. For the first time, Ernesto didn't know what to say. Ernesto tossed and turned that night, his thoughts muddled and uneasy. Anna's words kept echoing in his mind, soft but unrelenting. "I know what it's like to lose someone." He wanted to dismiss them, to bury them under the weight of his anger, but they wouldn't leave. They lingered like the faint smell of snow on the wind, tugging at something he couldn't quite name. The next morning, his body betrayed him. Fever crept in before breakfast, a dull heat that made his head heavy and his limbs weak. By afternoon, it had stolen his strength completely. He lay curled in his bed, shivering under layers of blankets that did nothing to fight the chill seeping into his bones. Adrian noticed first, standing awkwardly in the doorway, wringing his hands. "Ernesto, you need something? Water? I'll call the doctor, if it gets worse." But Adrian didn't know what to do with sickness, just as he didn't know what to do with grief. He disappeared downstairs after a few minutes, muttering about needing to chop firewood, leaving Ernesto to face the fever alone. Anna stepped into the room quietly that evening, a bowl of water balanced in one hand, a damp cloth in the other. She didn't speak as she set them on the bedside table. Ernesto cracked his eyes open, catching a glimpse of her shadowed face before he groaned and turned away. "You don't have to do this," he rasped, his voice raw and cracking like brittle wood. "I know," she said simply, dipping the cloth into the water. "But I will." Her words carried no edge, no weight of expectation. They were steady, like the rhythm of her hands wringing out the cloth. She pressed it to his forehead, her touch firm but gentle, and for the first time in days, the heat in his body seemed to lessen just slightly. The hours blurred. Ernesto drifted in and out of restless dreams, his thoughts feverish and jumbled. Sometimes he saw his mother's face, her soft smile as she sang lullabies in the old rocking chair. Other times he heard his father's voice, sharp and distant, calling out orders to men who worked the fields in summer. But more often than not, he felt Anna's presence. Quiet, constant, a weight in the room that anchored him. He didn't know when she stopped sitting by the bed and started pacing softly, whispering to herself. Her voice was low, words slipping out between prayers and soft murmurs of encouragement. "Please, God," she said once, her voice trembling barely more than a whisper. "Please, let him be okay. Let him stay strong." Ernesto wasn't sure if she meant him or herself. By the time he woke fully, the fever had broken. The room was still dim, shadows stretching long across the walls, but he felt lighter, his body finally his own again. He shifted under the blankets and winced at the ache in his muscles. The sound must have startled Anna, who had dozed off in the chair by the bed. She sat upright, blinking sleep from her eyes. "You're awake," she said, her voice a little hoarse. She stood quickly, smoothing her skirt before leaning over to check his forehead. Her hand was cool, her palm lingering for a moment longer than necessary. Good. The fever's gone down. Ernesto stared at her, unsure of what to say. It wasn't the first time he'd seen her up close, but it felt different now. Her face looked older than it did from across the dinner table. Lines etched around her mouth, her eyes tired but kind. She didn't look like someone trying to replace his mother. She just looked like someone who cared. "Why'd you stay?" he croaked, his voice still rough. "You didn't have to." Anna straightened, her lips twitching into a faint smile. "I told you. I wanted to." "That's not—" he faltered, fumbling for the right words. "I mean, why do you care?" She was quiet for a moment, her hands clasped in front of her. When she finally spoke, her words were soft but steady. "Because you matter, Ernesto, whether you believe it or not." Anna stayed by his side for the rest of the day, bringing him soup and water, fluffing his pillows when they sank too low. Ernesto let her, too tired to protest, but he watched her more closely now. He noticed the way she hummed under her breath while stirring the broth, the quiet care in her movements as she straightened the room. She didn't demand his gratitude or ask for anything in return. She just was there. By the time evening came, Ernesto found himself speaking without meaning to. "It's not fair," he mumbled, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. "What's not?" Anna asked, pausing mid-step. "Everything." He swallowed hard. "That she's gone, that you're here, that nothing feels right." Anna didn't answer immediately. She walked back to the chair and sat down, her hands folded in her lap. "No," she said finally, "it's not fair. But sometimes we don't get fair. We just get through." Her words settled over him like the blankets, warm and heavy. He wanted to argue, to tell her she didn't understand, but the memory of her voice from the night before stopped him. She did understand, in her own way. In the weeks that followed, Ernesto found himself changing, though he couldn't explain why. He stopped slamming doors when Anna was in the kitchen. He didn't pour salt into her stew or leave his muddy boots on the clean floor. When she asked for help setting the table, he grumbled but did it anyway, his hands moving without thought. Anna noticed, of course, but she didn't make a big deal out of it. She just smiled, a quiet kind of smile that didn't need words. And for the first time, Ernesto wondered if maybe, just maybe, this life with her didn't have to be so unbearable after all. Pasó el tiempo, semanas, luego meses, luego años, y Krill pronto creció. The train rumbled beneath Ernesto as he leaned against the window, his breath fogging up the glass. The fields rolled by in slow waves of green and gold. But his mind was already in the city, far ahead of where his body was now. He felt the weight of Anna's parting words from that morning pressing against his chest, though he tried to ignore it. "I packed enough for the week," she had said, slipping a bag into his hand. "There's stew in the jar, some bread. It'll keep you going until you're settled." Ernesto had taken the bag without a word. He couldn't bring himself to meet her eyes, couldn't find the words to say what he felt, or what he didn't feel. Instead, he had muttered, "Thanks," before stepping out the door. Adrian had clapped him on the shoulder, giving him one of those firm, fatherly pats that meant everything was fine, even when it wasn't. And then Ernesto had left, walking down the same dirt road he'd run on as a child, not once looking back. Life in the city was different, noisy, fast, and full of strangers who didn't care to know his name. Ernesto told himself he liked it that way. He could blend in, become invisible, and focus on his studies without anyone watching his every move. He called home when he had to, usually once a week, though the calls were short and strained. "How are classes?" Adrian would ask. "Fine," Ernesto would reply. "Busy." Anna always came on the line after that, her voice soft but steady. "Are you eating enough, Ernesto? You sound tired." "I'm fine," he'd say again, feeling the weight of her concern like an itch he couldn't scratch. "I have to go. Got a lot of homework." The calls always ended the same way, with Anna saying, "Take care, Ernesto," and him mumbling a distracted goodbye. He never asked how they were doing, never thought about how quiet the house must have been without him there. He had convinced himself that leaving was what he was supposed to do, that they didn't need him the way he had needed them when he was small. Holidays came, and with them, packages from home. The first time one arrived, Ernesto nearly laughed at the neat, careful handwriting on the label. For Ernesto. Inside were jars of pickles, homemade sausage, and a loaf of rye bread that smelled like the kitchen he'd grown up in. Anna had tucked a note inside. "Thought you might miss some real food. Love, Anna." Ernesto stared at the note for a long time before shoving it back into the box. He wasn't sure why it made his chest tighten or why the smell of the bread made him think of the nights she'd stood at the stove, stirring pots and humming under her breath. He wanted to tell himself it didn't matter, that the box was just another thing she felt obligated to send. But the way she had written love, Anna, simple, unassuming, not demanding anything from him, stayed with him longer than he cared to admit. By the time Ernesto met Nadia, he had grown comfortable in his independence. She was warm and lively, the kind of person who smiled at strangers and never hesitated to speak her mind. When he took her home to meet his family, she charmed Adrian in minutes, laughing at his dry humor and asking him questions about the tools in his shed. But it was Anna she seemed to take to the most. "Your mom's wonderful," Nadia said as they drove back to the city, her voice soft with admiration. "She made that pie just for me, didn't she?" "She's not my mom," Ernesto said automatically, his hands tightening on the wheel. "She's Anna." Nadia frowned, but didn't push the subject. "Well," she said after a moment, "she sure loves you like a mom would. Not everyone's that lucky." Ernesto didn't respond. He couldn't. The words sat heavy in his throat, twisting into something he wasn't ready to confront. The wedding was small but joyous. Anna had thrown herself into the preparations with a quiet energy that both annoyed and unsettled Ernesto. She sewed ribbons for the chairs, baked cookies for the guests, and even stayed up late, mending a loose button on his tuxedo. Every time he walked into the house, she seemed to be busy with something for him, humming softly, as if nothing had ever been wrong between them. "You don't have to do all this," he said one evening, watching her kneel by the hearth to warm a pot of soup. She glanced up, smiling faintly. "I know." "Then why?" "Because I want to," she said simply, her voice as calm as it had been that night in the woodshed all those years ago. "It's your day, Ernesto. I just want it to be special." He didn't know what to say. Her words didn't feel like guilt or obligation. They felt genuine in a way he wasn't ready to accept. As the years went by, Ernesto stayed busy, too busy to call as often as he should have, too busy to visit, except for the holidays. But every time he walked through the door of his childhood home, there was Anna, smiling in that quiet way of hers, asking if he'd eaten yet or if he needed her to fix anything. And every time Ernesto felt that same tug in his chest, the same strange mix of gratitude and guilt that he couldn't shake. He wanted to tell her something, to say thank you or sorry or maybe even Mom. But the words never came. Instead, he helped her carry the groceries or fix the latch on the gate, small gestures that felt easier than saying what he really meant. And Anna, as always, noticed without saying a word. The phone call came late in the evening, catching Ernesto off guard. He was in his living room, flipping through the mail, when Nadia called out from the other room, her voice tinged with excitement. "Ernesto, it's Anna. She wants to speak to you." Ernesto's first instinct was irritation. He'd just talked to her last week. But he sighed, put the mail down, and took the receiver. "Hello?" Her voice came through warm and bright, the kind of voice that made you feel like you were standing in a sunny kitchen. "Ernesto, I heard the news. Nadia told me." There was a pause, and he could almost picture her leaning forward, clutching the phone like it was the most precious thing in the world. "You're having a baby." For a moment, Ernesto didn't know how to respond. The way she said it, soft, trembling with emotion, made the words feel bigger than they were. "Yeah," he finally said, his tone clipped. "We are." "Oh, Ernesto," she breathed. "I'm so happy for you." Months passed, and the baby came one cold morning in January, his cries sharp and clear as the frost on the window. Ernesto had never been good with words, but when the nurse handed him his son, all wrinkled and pink, something inside him shifted. He stared at the tiny face, his heart thudding in a way that made him feel both elated and terrified. Anna arrived 2 days later, her arms full of neatly packed bags of food and clothes. She bustled into the small hospital room like she belonged there, her face glowing with a kind of joy Ernesto hadn't seen in years. She didn't go to him first. She went straight to Nadia, pressing her hands gently against her shoulders. "You did so well, sweetheart," Anna said, her voice soft but steady. "Look at him. He's perfect." Ernesto watched as she turned to the bassinet, her hands trembling as she reached for the baby. When she picked him up, her smile broke into something so tender it made Ernesto's chest ache. She cradled the baby like he was made of glass, her face glowing as she whispered, "Oh, aren't you just a little miracle?" In the weeks that followed, Anna became a fixture in their home. She came by every morning, carrying jars of soup, baked bread, and neatly folded laundry. Nadia adored her, often pulling her into the kitchen to chat or asking for advice on everything from diaper brands to bedtime routines. Ernesto kept his distance, though he noticed how effortlessly Anna slipped into her role as a grandmother. She cooed at the baby, sang lullabies under her breath, and walked the floor with him when he cried late into the night. Watching her, Ernesto felt a pang of something he couldn't name, a mix of guilt, gratitude, and confusion. One night, as he stood in the hallway watching her rock the baby to sleep, Nadia came up beside him, resting her head on his shoulder. "She's amazing, isn't she?" she whispered. Ernesto shrugged, his eyes never leaving Anna. "She's fine." "Don't do that," Nadia said, her tone light but firm. "You know she's more than fine. She loves him. You can see it in everything she does." Ernesto didn't respond, but deep down, he knew Nadia was right. It wasn't long before Ernesto started to notice how much Anna's presence brought warmth into their lives. She didn't just care for the baby. She cared for all of them, in ways that felt quiet and steady. She fixed Nadia's broken teacup without being asked, leaving it on the counter as though it had never been shattered. She mended the loose hem on Ernesto's coat, slipping it back into the closet without a word. Every act was small, unspoken, but it carried a weight he couldn't ignore. Still, he struggled with the way she made him feel. Her patience, her quiet devotion. It reminded him of the things he'd spent so many years trying not to think about. It wasn't just guilt anymore. It was regret. Regret for the years he'd spent resenting her, for the times he'd let her kindness go unnoticed. He found himself watching her more closely, trying to understand how someone could give so much without asking for anything in return. One evening, as she stood in the kitchen stirring a pot of soup, he finally spoke. "Why do you do all this?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. "You don't have to." Anna turned, her face calm as she set down the spoon. "Because I love you," she said simply, as though it was the most obvious thing in the world. "And now I love him too." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Ernesto opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. He didn't know how to tell her what he felt or even what he wanted to feel, so he just nodded, turning away before she could see the look in his eyes. It started with little things. Anna was slower to get up in the mornings, her steps careful and measured, like she was trying to conserve her energy. She waved it off when anyone asked. "I'm just getting old," she'd say, with a soft smile, brushing away their concern like crumbs from a table. But Adrian noticed. He noticed how she sat down more often while cooking, how her hands shook when she poured her tea, how her laugh didn't carry the same warmth it used to. He tried to convince himself it was nothing, that everyone slowed down eventually, until the day he came home early and found her on the couch, her face pale and drawn, her breathing shallow. "Anna," he said, his voice cracking as he knelt beside her. "What's wrong? Is it your heart?" She shook her head, trying to sit up, but the effort left her trembling. "It's nothing," she whispered. I just need a moment." Adrian didn't believe her. He helped her into the car and drove straight to the hospital, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. When Ernesto got the call that evening, the silence on the other end of the line told him more than his father's words ever could. "It's Anna," Adrian said finally, his voice rough with exhaustion. She's sick. They think it might be cancer." Ernesto's stomach dropped. "What kind of cancer?" he asked, his voice sharper than he intended. "They don't know yet," Adrian admitted. "They're running tests. But son, it doesn't look good." The diagnosis came a week later: advanced ovarian cancer. The doctors spoke in calm, clinical tones about treatment options, but the words sounded hollow. Chemotherapy might buy her time, but there were no guarantees. The prognosis was grim. Months, not years. Anna took the news with a quiet acceptance that made Ernesto's chest ache. "It's okay," she said, squeezing Adrian's hand as the doctor explained the next steps. "I've had a good life. Let's just focus on the time we have." But Ernesto wasn't ready to let go. He threw himself into researching specialists, calling hospitals across the state, poring over websites late into the night. Nadia found him once, sitting at the kitchen table, with a notebook full of scribbled phone numbers and medical jargon. "You're doing everything you can," she said, resting a hand on his shoulder. "You know that, right?" "It's not enough," he muttered, flipping another page. "There has to be someone who can fix this." They tried everything: second opinions, experimental drugs, even a consultation with an oncologist in New York who came highly recommended. But the answers were always the same. The cancer was too advanced. The treatments might ease her symptoms, but they couldn't cure her. Ernesto hated the word palliative. It felt like giving up. But Anna embraced it with the same quiet grace she brought to everything in her life. She went to her appointments, took her medications, and spent her good days doing the things she loved: cooking, gardening, rocking her grandson to sleep. "It's enough," she told Ernesto one evening when he came to visit and found her sitting on the porch, watching the sun dip below the trees. "I don't need more time. I just need the time I have to be good." Ernesto sat down beside her, staring at the horizon. "It's not fair," he said after a long silence. "You don't deserve this." "No one deserves this," Anna replied, her voice gentle. "But life isn't fair, Ernesto. You know that." He swallowed hard, his throat tight. "I wish I could do more." "You're here," she said simply. "That's enough." The church was filled to the brim. People from every corner of the village had come to say goodbye to Anna. Neighbors, friends, and even those who only knew her through her kind reputation. The pews groaned under their weight, the air heavy with quiet murmurs and the faint smell of candle wax. Ernesto stood at the front, stiff in his black suit, his eyes fixed on the polished wood of the casket. He hadn't cried yet. The priest's voice droned on, delivering words about heaven and peace, but Ernesto barely heard them. His chest ached with something he couldn't name: grief, guilt, or maybe both. When the time came to speak, Nadia nudged his elbow gently. He hesitated but stepped forward. He looked out at the crowd, their faces solemn and expectant. Then his gaze drifted back to the casket. "Anna?" His voice cracked on the name and he had to pause, swallowing hard. She wasn't just kind. She wasn't just strong. She was my mom. A murmur rippled through the room, but Ernesto didn't notice. The words spilled out like water breaking through a dam. "I didn't always treat her that way, and I regret that. But she loved me anyway. She loved all of us, selflessly, without asking for anything in return. And I'll never be able to thank her enough for that." The tears came then, hot and relentless, and for the first time in years, Ernesto let them. He stood there, crying in front of everyone, his voice raw as he whispered, "I love you, Mum." The burial followed the service. The small procession wound its way to the cemetery on the hill, the sun dipping low and casting long shadows over the rows of headstones. Anna was to be buried beside Adrian's first wife, Ernesto's mother. It felt fitting somehow. The gravediggers worked quickly, lowering Anna's casket with care. Ernesto stayed close, his eyes never leaving the grave. He wanted to make sure everything was perfect for her, even if it was too late for her to know it. Then, as they prepared to fill the grave, a commotion broke out near the edge of the plot. One of the workers had struck something buried deep in the ground. The clang of metal against wood rang out, sharp and jarring against the stillness. "What's that?" someone asked, peering closer. "It's another coffin," one of the men muttered, brushing dirt away with gloved hands. Ernesto stepped forward, his brow furrowed. "What are you talking about? That's impossible. This plot's for my mother and father. There's no one else buried here." The workers exchanged uneasy glances. One of them shrugged and reached for the lid. "Probably just a mix-up. I'll open it." "No!" Ernesto's voice rang out, but it was too late. The lid creaked open, revealing not a body, but bricks stacked neatly inside. The crowd gasped. Ernesto stared, frozen, his mind reeling. That coffin. It was supposed to be his mother's. This can't be, he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. It's not possible. Ernesto's hands trembled as he climbed into the grave to inspect the coffin himself. The bricks inside were old, crumbling at the edges, but there was no mistaking it. This was the casket that had been lowered into the ground all those years ago, the one he had cried over, believing his mother was inside. He turned to the workers, his voice tight with barely contained panic. Not a word of this. Do you understand? Not one word to anyone. They nodded, their faces pale, and quickly began covering the coffin back up. When the grave was filled and the crowd dispersed, Ernesto found Adrian standing at the edge of the cemetery, his shoulders slumped. Ernesto approached him, his jaw set, his eyes blazing with questions. Tell me what's going on, he demanded. Now. Adrian hesitated, his gaze fixed on the ground. Ernesto, this isn't the time. It's the only time, Ernesto snapped. I need to know. Adrian sighed, his face crumpling with the weight of years-long secrets. Your mother, he began, his voice low. She's not in that grave. Ernesto's stomach churned. What do you mean? You told me she died in the accident. That she was too badly burned, He couldn't finish the sentence. I lied, Adrian admitted, his voice cracking. Your mother didn't die in that crash. She wasn't even in the car. Ernesto staggered back a step, his mind racing. Why? Why would you lie about something like that? Because she left, Adrian said, his tone bitter. She ran off with another man. Left me, left you. She wanted out of this life, out of her responsibilities. And she needed everyone to think she was gone so they wouldn't come looking for her. Ernesto stared at him, his heart pounding. You knew? You knew she abandoned us, and you still let me think she was... Adrian's eyes were glassy with unshed tears. I thought it was better this way. What was I supposed to tell you? That your mother chose someone else over her own family? I couldn't do that to you, Ernesto. You were just a boy. Ernesto sat back on the damp grass, his head tilted toward the grey sky. For a long time, he didn't speak. The weight of the truth sat heavily on his chest, pressing into him like a boulder he couldn't move. His hands clenched the grass beneath him, as if he could anchor himself to the earth. But nothing felt solid anymore. When I was a kid, Ernesto began, his voice distant, I used to sit by her grave and talk to her. I'd tell her about school, about the fights I had with the other boys. I'd ask her for advice when I didn't know what to do. He laughed bitterly, shaking his head. And the whole time, she wasn't even there. Adrian didn't answer. What could he say? His silence was an admission, and that was enough. She left us, Ernesto said, his tone hardening. She just left, and you let me believe she loved me. He turned to his father, his eyes blazing with anger and something deeper, betrayal. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you just tell me the truth? Adrian's face crumpled. Because you needed to believe in her, he said quietly. You needed to believe she was better than she was. I thought it would hurt less if you didn't know. Well, you thought wrong, Ernesto snapped, standing abruptly. He paced a few steps, his fists clenched at his sides. All these years, I hated Anna because I thought she was taking her place. I thought she was trying to replace someone who could never be replaced. But it was all a lie. There was nothing to replace. The days that followed were a blur. Ernesto couldn't shake the image of the empty coffin, the bricks stacked like some cruel joke. He avoided Adrian, knowing that if he stayed too long in his father's presence, He'd say something he couldn't take back. Instead, he threw himself into the preparations for Anna's funeral. He met with the stonecutter personally, insisting on approving the design for her headstone. It was simple, but beautiful. Grey granite with her name etched in careful, flowing letters. Beneath it, he had them carve the words, "The most loving mother, forever in our hearts." When the stonecutter asked if he wanted something similar for his biological mother's grave, Ernesto shook his head. "Just leave it," he said shortly. He didn't owe her anything. The day of the funeral was cold and overcast, the kind of weather that seemed to mirror the heaviness in Ernesto's chest. People from all over the village came to pay their respects, crowding into the small church to hear the eulogy. Adrian sat in the front pew, his shoulders hunched, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Nadia sat beside Ernesto, her hand resting gently on his arm, a quiet reminder that he wasn't alone. When it was Ernesto's turn to speak, he walked to the front of the church with slow, deliberate steps. He took a deep breath. The paper with his speech crumpled in his hand. But when he looked out at the crowd, he realized he didn't need it. "Anna wasn't my mother by blood," he began, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "But she was my mother in every way that mattered. She loved me when I didn't deserve it. She stood by me when I pushed her away. And she gave me something I never even realized I needed: patience, kindness, and a home." His voice wavered, but he kept going. "I didn't see it then. I was too caught up in my own pain to see what was right in front of me. But she never gave up on me. And for that, I'll be grateful for the rest of my life." He paused, his eyes locking on the casket in front of him. "I love you, Mom," he said softly, the words finally coming out after years of silence. "And I'm sorry it took me so long to say it." At the graveside, as the casket was lowered into the ground, Ernesto stood motionless, his face unreadable. The priest said a final prayer, and the sound of dirt hitting the wood echoed in the still air. Then, from above, came a soft cry. Ernesto looked up to see a flock of cranes flying overhead, their white wings cutting through the grey sky. One of them broke away from the group, circling low before soaring higher again. The sight brought a hush over the crowd, and someone whispered, "It's her. She's saying goodbye." Ernesto's chest tightened, a strange sense of peace washing over him. He didn't believe in signs or omens, but in that moment, he wanted to. He wanted to believe Anna was still with him, watching over them, guiding him even now. In the weeks that followed, the village spoke often of Anna's funeral. They remembered her as a woman of quiet strength, someone who gave more than she took and left the world better than she found it. To Ernesto, those words felt both comforting and incomplete. They couldn't capture the full measure of who she was, of what she had meant to him. But as he stood at her grave one last time before returning to the city, he realized it didn't matter. What mattered was the love she had given him, the lessons she had taught him. Not through words, but through her actions. And as he laid a single white rose on her headstone, he whispered, "Thank you, Mom, for everything." The air between Ernesto and his father was thick for weeks after Anna's funeral. Conversations were sparse, filled with practicalities instead of emotion. They moved like two men walking parallel paths, close enough to see each other, but too far to truly connect. Yet, neither of them said the words still hanging between them, the ones about the empty coffin, the bricks, and the lies that had shaped so much of Ernesto's life. It was Anna who brought them together again, though she wasn't there to see it. On the third Sunday after the funeral, Ernesto drove back to the village, his son sleeping in the car seat beside him. They arrived in the afternoon, the wind sharp, but the sunlight soft. His father was already at the cemetery, bent over Anna's grave with a small trowel in his hand, planting flowers along the base of the headstone. Ernesto hesitated before joining him. "You missed a spot," he said, pointing to the empty patch near the edge. Adrian looked up, startled at first, then gave a small, weary smile. "Guess my eyes aren't what they used to be." He handed Ernesto the trowel. "Here, you fix it." Ernesto knelt beside him, pressing the trowel into the dirt. They worked in silence, the kind that wasn't entirely comfortable but wasn't hostile either. When the flowers were finally planted, Adrian sat back on his heels, brushing his hands on his pants. "She would have liked this," he said quietly. "She always wanted flowers here." Ernesto nodded, his gaze fixed on the headstone. "Yeah," he said softly. "She would have." Over time, those afternoons at the cemetery became a ritual. Once a month, Ernesto and Adrian tended to Anna's grave, planting fresh flowers in the spring and clearing away the snow in the winter. The quiet work gave them space to speak, not just about Anna, but about the past, the future, and the things they'd never had the courage to say before. One late summer afternoon, as they sat on the bench nearby, Adrian broke the silence. "I know I made mistakes, Ernesto. With your mother. With Anna. With you." He paused, running a hand over his face. I did what I thought was right, even if it wasn't." Ernesto didn't respond right away. He thought about the years of anger, the bitterness that had clouded his memories of Anna. He thought about how much his father must have carried alone, the secrets he kept, the lies he told to protect them both. "I get it," Ernesto said finally. "I didn't then, but I do now." Adrian turned to him, his eyes searching. "Do you forgive me?" Ernesto met his gaze, the weight of the question heavy between them. "I'm trying," he said. "But yeah, I think I do." Ernesto's visits to the village became more frequent after that. He brought his son with him each time, watching as the boy grew to love the same fields and woods Ernesto had run through as a child. Nadia often joined them on weekends, sitting on the porch with Adrian, laughing at his dry humor while Ernesto worked on small repairs around the house. And every time he visited the cemetery, he made sure to bring his son. He'd sit the boy on his lap in front of Anna's grave and tell him stories, not just about her kindness, but about the quiet strength she had shown in raising him. "She loved you, you know," he'd say, his voice steady. "Even before you were born. She loved you." His son would listen, wide-eyed, sometimes asking questions that made Ernesto laugh softly. And in those moments, he felt Anna's presence, as if she were still guiding him, still teaching him how to be the man she had always believed he could be. One autumn evening, Ernesto stood by the kitchen window of his childhood home, watching the leaves scatter across the yard. His father was outside with his grandson, showing the boy how to build a birdhouse. Nadia was stirring something on the stove, the smell of apples and cinnamon filling the air. For the first time in years, Ernesto felt a sense of calm, a sense that things were as they should be. Anna had once told him that life wasn't fair, that they didn't get to choose the pain or the losses. But she had also shown him how to find joy in the small things, how to love even when it hurt. And now, as he watched his father laugh with his son, Ernesto understood that lesson more deeply than ever. He walked out to the porch, leaning against the railing as he called out to them. "You better not be making a mess out here." Adrian grinned, holding up the half-finished birdhouse. We're Making memories, not messes. Ernesto smiled, his heart lighter than it had been in years. Good, he said. Make sure they're good ones. And in that moment, he knew they would be. Ernesto's story is a deeply moving journey filled with emotional layers that explore grief, regret, love, and reconciliation. From the loss of his biological mother, his initial rejection of Anna, to his eventual acceptance of her as the true maternal figure in his life, Ernesto's character development is a powerful reflection of the internal struggles many face when dealing with their own emotional wounds. What makes Ernesto's journey so impactful is its authenticity. He is not a perfect hero. He is flawed, full of contradictions, anger, and regret. Yet his evolution, driven by Anna's quiet sacrifice and unconditional love, transforms him into a man who learns the true meaning of family. It's not about who shares your blood, but who stays, who loves you unconditionally, and who guides you through your darkest moments. The story leaves a profound lesson. Love and forgiveness have the power to heal even the deepest wounds. Anna reminds us that sacrifice and patience can change lives, and Ernesto teaches us that it's never too late to recognize and honor those who truly matter. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and share it. Leave a comment to tell us how it inspired you, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. May God bless you and be with you every step of the way.